And thank you so much for having me at the conference. I'm just sorry that I can't be with you in person. It's the way it is. I wish you well. I hope it goes well indeed. I thought in this paper that I'm going to present, I would look at something that is a bit of an exploratory paper. It's about Eritrea's complex polity, and it looks at the relationship between its peoples, its ethnicities, and how this has been used to divide the nation over the years. I won't go into the way in which the regime acts, because you all know that too well. What I'm trying to look at is a different relationship and some of the more unspoken issues that sometimes come up. So let me just begin, and I will read a section of what I have written. Thank you very much. What follows is less certain and more complex. The questions remain: what makes Eritrea such a complex nation? To examine this, we will require to look at elements that make up its people or its peoples, depending on your perspective. First, without rehearsing Eritrea's complex history down the centuries or becoming bogged down in anthropology, who are the peoples who are considered part of one nation? Secondly, how did these divisions lead to such difficult relationship between the country's ethnic groups that has been impotent in the face of internal repression? The people of Eritrea have traditionally been divided into various ethnic groups. The CIA Fact Book, a normally accurate source of basic information, suggests that they consist of the Tigrayans at 50%, Tigray at 30%, the Saho at 4%, and then other groups smaller, including the Afar, the Kunama, the Belain, the Beja, the Nara, and the Rashida. Like all such facts, they hide as much as they explain. Nations are almost inevitably divided along ethnic lines. In Britain, for example, there are many more ethnic nations than the Scots, Welsh, Irish, and English. The Cornish, for example, claim their own rights, as do the Gaelic-speaking Scots. This is before one begins to add the many communities who settled in Britain. This includes the French, some 300,000 of whom live in the UK, or the 180,000 strong Somali community who've lived in Britain for generations, encouraged by the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Eritreans numbered about 26,100 in England and Wales, according to the 2021 UK census. All peoples and nations have their own myths, legends, prejudices, and beliefs, which are handed down the generations and form an important part of popular culture. For example, the Germans look back to the time when the Germanic tribes defeated the Romans at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD as a symbol of resistance to foreign domination. The battle between the Serbs and the Ottomans on the Field of Blackbirds in 1389 shares a similar status in Serbian imagination. Such belief systems can unite or divide a nation. They're frequently drawn upon by politicians. In exploring what divides and united Eritrea's peoples, we need to consider these questions, since they are surely inaccurate to point only to the wiles of Isaias Afwerki to explain why democratic movements have proved so vociferous and prone to collapse. To look at this, I'll examine two aspects of Eritrean life: the role of ethnic minorities and the question of the Italian Ascaris. Minorities pose a problem for all nations. How to give them an appropriate weight in public affairs is a difficult question across the globe, and Eritrea is no exception. Minorities can be abused in many ways, but they can also be mobilized by regimes for their own purposes, both for internal purposes and by neighboring states. The situation of Eritrea's minorities is understood by its people, but is less commonly explored in academic work. The Nara people are a case in point. A mostly Muslim people who live north of Barentu, they are sometimes termed Baria. It's a term designating a slave in Amharic. and apologies for my pronunciation. They were converted from their traditional religion to Islam in the 17th century, but this didn't save them from, quote, continual raids by their Muslim and Christian neighbors who often enslaved them. According to oral history, these differences often arose around competition for grazing on the in the Gash-Barka region. The competition over land and settlement of diverse groups in the Gash-Barka area are themselves sufficient factors for contribute to tensions. There are also other competing factors. These factors include the policies of the state, the contempt for the Tigrinya towards other groups, and the legacy of historical animosity between the Kunama and other ethnic groups of the country. That's a quote. The combination of raids and enslavement meant that the Nara welcomed Italian colonialism when it arrived, since the Italians recognized their independent tribal leaders and ended the raids against them. During the 1950s, under British rule, ethnic tensions led to conflict as the various ethnic groups competed for grazing. Some Nara joined the Eritrean Liberation Front in the 1960s. This was just one factor that led to antagonism between the Nara and the EPLF. If relations with the Nara were poor, relations with the Kunama were even more difficult. The Kunama also inhabit the Gash-Barka region, previously known as Gash-Setit, and are sedentary agriculturists rather than pastoral people. In 1984 to 85, the Ethiopian census numbered them at 100,000. They too have been enslaved down the years. Before Italian colonization, Ethiopian highlanders raided the Kunama, who followed their traditional faiths, and the Kunama occasionally carried out reciprocal raids, sometimes taking women captive. The Ethiopian general Razalula raided Kunama under Emperor Yohannes and then Melek, while the Kunama men fighting the incomers and women and children hid in caves, only to be smoked out by the raiders. These events are seared into Kunama consciousness, with one form of abuse between the Kunama during disputes declaring, "I curse you that you have been captured by Abyssinians, Tigraeans, and Turks respectively." That's just one form of abuse. Colonialism by the Italians brought a measure of relief for the Kunama, with an end to raids from Ethiopia. This period is looked back on with nostalgia, and Italians are regarded as better than the regimes of Haile Selassie, the Derg, or the current Eritrean government. The Kunama volunteered to join the Italian army as Ascaris, with men walking to Amandafera and Asmara to seek recruitment. The Italian uniforms, which incorporated a fez and a tassel, are said to have been particularly appealing to the Kunama. Relations with the Eritrean liberation movements were far more difficult, with the ELF being accused of carrying out raids on Kunama communities in the 1960s. This had catastrophic consequences, leading to some Kunamas to support Ethiopian rule after the start of the armed struggle. In 1965, the Ethiopians recruited a Kunama militia. A decade later, the Derg courted Kunama loyalty, while an already widespread racist perception among non-Nilotic Eritreans, Muslims and Christians, that the Kunama were somehow not Eritrean, further alienated them from nationalist fronts. Relations were mended to some degree by the EPLF, which provided Kunama with social services and education, but this did not last. Matters came to a head during Eritrea's disastrous border war with Ethiopia in 1998 to 2000. Much of the fighting took place in Kunama areas, causing widespread destruction and displacement. Quote, "This, coupled with anger over conscription of Kunama youth for the war effort and resettlement of Tigraean-speaking refugees in Kunama areas, underway since the 1940s, but intensified in the 1990s, fueled resentment in many of these communities." End quote. It led to the formation of a Kunama-based armed resistance movement, the Democratic Movement for the Liberation of Eritrean Kunama, DMLEK. It also resulted in what is described as a widespread belief by Kunama that that Kunama were collaborators with the Ethiopian government and were not loyal Eritreans. Members of DMLEK were accused of accompanying the Ethiopian army during the occupation of the Gash and Setit areas. Although they were not the only Eritreans who worked with the Ethiopian invaders, other ethnic groups were not considered collaborators. Alexander Nati remarks that the use of the term collaborator is only made about the Kunama. He goes on to recall that, quote, there were thousands of Kunama in the ELF and later in the EPLF who died for Eritrea. There are thousands of young Kunama in the Eritrean Defense Forces who are dying for Eritrea now. How would they feel when they were constantly reminded that the Kunama are collaborators and traitors? Is it any surprise that, as the minority rights group observed, the Kunama, quote, have had a deep distrust of the EPLF and have been repressed for years because they are seen as too close to Ethiopia? The Kunama and the Nara are by no means exceptional among Eritrean minorities. The Rashida, some of whom move between Arabia, Sudan, and Eritrea, are generally regarded by other ethnicities as loose and even dangerous. It's a reputation perhaps derived from their history of involvement in enslavement of other Eritrean peoples. In the 1890s, for example, they were witnessed taking Beja people who'd been captured in the Kassala region to Arabia. Quote, almost all that party of slaves have been taken over to the Arabian side of the Red Sea and sold there in open markets. Eritrea's Ascaris. The Italian colonialists recruited and came to rely on large numbers of Eritreans for their local security and in their wars against Ethiopia and Libya. Between 1890 and 1941, more than 130,000 Eritreans served as Ascaris, representing 1 in 10 of the labor force. This helped reshape Eritrean economy, depriving households of labor for their farms, but also providing large sums of money, which drew Eritreans into the modern economy. Eritrean troops served with this distinction in many campaigns, beginning with their contribution at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, when 2,000 of the 5,000 Eritreans who accompanied the Italian invasion of Ethiopia lost their lives. They held out even when other brigades broke and fled, and some 800 Ascaris were captured by the Ethiopians, and they were treated as traitors. They had their right hands and left feet amputated. Despite the sacrifices, young Eritreans were not put off being recruited by the Italians. Better wages drew some 60,000 to volunteer to serve in Libya from 1911 to 1932. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, conscription was introduced and a further 60,000 Ascaris joined Italian forces. Discontent with their treatment under the fascists led to some desertions, but Ascaris went on to train Ethiopian militia after Addis Ababa was captured by the Italians and Ethiopia was largely occupied. The Ascaris fought alongside the Italians when British-led forces invaded from Sudan in 1940. After the defeat of the Italians at the Battle of Keren in March 1941, over 9,000 Eritreans who'd served as Ascaris were interned in Sudan before finally being demobilized. As they'd fought with an enemy force, they received no compensation from the British military administration, leading to increased hardship, unemployment, and poverty. The Ascari experience appears to have had a considerable impact on Eritrean culture and politics. Recruitment by the Italians appears to have welded Eritreans together. Quote, the massive recruitment of Eritreans in the colonial administration, and especially in the army, changed their own perception of their ethnic and religious identity. Colonial soldiers were first of all taught to serve under the Italian banner and to be loyal to their armed section. Even though differences in ethnicity and religion were to a certain extent taken into account in the formation of battalions, platoons, and divisions, these were often socially and culturally mixed. As Dira points out, fighting side by side with men from neighboring territories who had also migrated to the city at least partially smoothed, quote, localism and ethnic-based antagonism and paved the way for the development of a germinal Eritrean nationalist feeling. That's the end of that quote. If Italian colonialism helped unite Eritreans, the same cannot be said of the British administration. This was partly because the high-handed attitude adopted by the British in Eritrea. Britain, which elected a Labour government at the end of the war, was committed to ending empire and had no interest in gaining a new colony. Administrators sought to either divide Eritreans or to unite it with Ethiopia. It suggested that London planned to exchange the Eritrean highlands for the Ogaden, while attempting to unite Eritrean lowlands with Sudan. In the event, administrators from Britain failed to come up with an acceptable plan and left the issue to the United Nations. Their indecision, as is well known, produced uncertainty, provoked ethnic and religious tensions, which led to clashes that Eritrea had not witnessed under the Eritreans. The ethnic violence was recorded by the British administrator Gerald Travaskis. Quote, the structure of Eritrean political unity, erected during the Italian regime, had concealed the fundamental conflicts of culture and interest among the Eritrean communities. Fighting between Christian villages of the Hamsin and the Serai and the Muslim Banda Amir assumed a new and ugly ferocity. Fighting broke out once more between the Kunama and their unwelcome neighbours in the old battlegrounds of the Gash Setit lowlands, and just as fiercely between the Muslim Saho and their Christian neighbours. On the plateau itself, the sturdy Muslim minority in the Serai clashed with the Christian minority and with the help of the Bani Amir, and to some extent from the Saho, gave a surprisingly good account of itself. The small, feeble minority in the Hamsin, after a brief effervescence, was terrorized into inactive silence. On the northern flank of the plateau, occasional clashes occurred between the villages of the Hamsin and the Tigray clans of the coastal plain. The only part of Eritrea to which conflagration did not spread was the territory remote extremities, the northern highlands and the Danakil lowlands. And that was the view of Travaskis. Christians agitated for unification with Ethiopia, while Muslims wished to be united with Sudan. This is well researched. Travaskis concluded, although no Eritrean, Italian, or British officer ever doubted that the Unionist Party and the Ethiopian government had instigated the disturbances, few seriously credited them with having intended so general a conflagration. It was really bad, clearly. Astia al-Mendon challenged this interpretation of events, arguing that it was the British who provoked the disturbances. They were, quote, worse than the Italians, who were not as deceitful and underhand. The British military administration seldom honoured its promises and was even more exploitative. Eritreans were always severely punished with heavy fines for apparently exercising their rights to articulate their concerns through peaceful demonstrations which turned into riots every time the British or Italian police used force to hunt down the so-called ringleaders, end quote. In the event, the British left and Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia, which was then incorporated into Haile Selassie's empire, only to see the beginning of the armed struggle that finally resulted in the EPLF taking Asmara in 1991, and so to the international recognition of independence 2 years later. Some lessons. What can be drawn from this exploration of the ethnic question, the role of the Ascaris in Eritrean society? In particular, what could occur once President Isaias Afwerki is no longer in control of the fate of the country with such an iron hand? We've seen the depth of division that have existed between ethnic groups, divisions which are then overlaid by religious differences. In debate about unification with Ethiopia in the 1940s, these spilled over into open conflicts. The religious differences reared their heads once more in the split between the EPLF and the ELF in the 1960s and 70s, causing divisions which have yet to be eradicated. Some have suggested that these rifts have been exaggerated. Quote, centuries of social intermingling, economic interaction, and shared suffering under different rulers had rendered ethnic and religious distinctions ambiguous and, in many cases, interchangeable. The case Gaim Kibriab makes is powerfully argued. That was his quote. Of course, it is possible that a new Eritrean movement will arise, which not only succeeds in uniting the Eritrean opposition, but manages to challenge and finally overthrow the current regime. The emergence of Brigade Nahamadu, or the Blue Revolution, has brought Eritrean members of the diaspora together in Addis Ababa in January this year. However, it's too early to come to any conclusion about how this will develop. If the past is any guide to the future, they are likely to struggle to overcome the differences that have been outlined above. It's worth considering the comparable situation in Yugoslavia before its demise in 1992. While there had been ethnic tensions between the 9 or more ethnic groups, they had existed alongside one another in relative peace until the death of Tito in 1980, at which point one of Europe's most vicious conflicts since the Second World War erupted, leaving over 130,000 dead. Similar examples are scattered around the world. Eritreans cannot assume that ethnic and religious divisions will not emerge once President Isaias is no longer in charge. If this is one side of the argument, the legacy of the Ascaris is the other. They appear to have overcome divisions under the Italians. They became a resolute fighting force that contributed to Italy's wars in Ethiopia, Italy, and against the British. Ethnic and religious issues appear to have been left behind when Eritreans from very different backgrounds put on their uniforms. During the 30-year War of Independence, Eritreans came together, even though they fought bitter civil wars that still resonate to this day. Since 1991, they've been brought together in a national army. Indefinite conscription in the guise of national service has taken a terrible toll on Eritrea's young people. However, they have worked and fought together along Eritrea's borders and in President Isaias's many foreign wars. There have been and continue to be innumerable Eritrean political parties and movements. Some are credible, most are not. The hope must surely be that once the dictatorship ends, the army, drawing on the legacy of the Ascaris and the sacrifice of Eritrean fighters and the troops down the years, will hold the country together. What other organizational force could overcome the differences that have been sketched above, or face the intrigues that are likely to be fostered by foreign powers? That is the end of my presentation. As I say, it is only a rough paper, something I'm still working on, but I hope it was helpful, and I wish you well with your conference. Thank you very much.